when it was over and somewhat more comprehensible, we could see that the war left us with, if nothing else, two prodigious and enduring metaphors for human suffering: Auschwitz and Hiroshima. History has carved no sterner monuments to its own propensity for unfathomable evil. After VJ Day, there was a space of a year or so when it was truly possible to conceive of a world without war. Progenitors of the baby boom, most veterans were diligently amorous. It may be that the gloom descended soon after Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. For me, the sense of the future closing down permanently came only 6 years later, when as a Marine Reserve, I was called up for duty in the Korean War. Back in infantry training, I had the nightmarish perception of war as a savage continuum, not a wholesome, if often lethal adventure men embarked upon, as in World War II, to strike down the forces of evil, but a perpetual way of life in which small areas of peacetime provided intermittent relief. In Asia, there was an explosion waiting to happen. America stood ready to light the fuse the French had laid down, and in the next decade, the sequel of Vietnam came as no surprise. In that same decade of the 1960s, I became engrossed in the issue of racial conflict in America, especially as it was reflected in the history of slavery. And I found myself pondering the extent to which race and racial domination played a part in the recent wars. The stunning late 19th century insight of W.E.B. Du Bois that the chief problem of the coming century would be that of color had swiftly become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Du Bois was speaking of his own African-American people, but his prophecy would embrace the globe. If in the First World War nationalistic ambitions largely fueled the conflict, World War II was the incubator of a poisonous and worldwide racism. A poster I recall from the Pacific War was of a buck-toothed and bespectacled rat with repulsively coiled tail and a Japanese army cap, and the legend beneath it said, "Know your enemy." All Americans fighting in the Pacific were racists. Marines were indoctrinated to regard Japanese soldiers as dangerously rabid animals. The paucity of enemy prisoners taken by our troops was due in part to the Japanese creed of fighting to the last breath, but it was also because of our own policy of extermination, often with an intriguing new weapon, the flamethrower, which roasted our adversaries in their bunkers and burrows. The enemy repaid our racism in kind and generally surpassed us. Few people were treated more barbarically than those starving prisoners, many of them European and American, but also Asian, who existed amid squalor and privation in the Japanese camps. Hiroshima had a profound effect on my life. Auschwitz would come later. In the summer of 1945, I was a young Marine officer slated to lead my rifle platoon in the invasion of Japan. Most of us were spunky but scared, and we had much to be scared about. The carnage had reached a surreal intensity. Already on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, 17,000 Americans had lost their lives, including many of the people that I and my pals on the island called our friends. It had been predicted that the invasion would produce over 500,000 American casualties, while perhaps as many as 3 times that number of Japanese would be killed or wounded, including countless civilians. I have a passage that I wanted to read from a work of fiction that I'm completing, where I allude to this particular situation as follows. The setting is Saipan, where the 2nd Marine Division was being prepared for the invasion of Japan. We were all affected, newcomers and combat veterans alike. A fighting man's resistance to fear is no doubt determined by a constellation of factors, one or several of which may instill the requisite fortitude. That is, endocrine flow, genes, some arduously developed grittiness of character, the crucible of experience, or in a few men, perhaps a certain stupidity. Absence of imagination provides a nearly perfect insulation against fear, although, thank God, not many minds harbor such an absolute vacuum. Those among us who suffered fear the most were the ones who had already been in battle. When I arrived on Saipan, most of the kids in my platoon were as raw and as inexperienced as I was, but I had been assigned a few of the old guys too. I felt miserably inadequate to leading these Marines into what I pictorially conceived, dripping fangs and all, as the jaws of death. One of my BAR men, an undersized farm boy from North Dakota, had seen strewn on the Tarawa beachhead a string of guts 12 feet long belonging to his best buddy. Here in last year's Battle of Saipan, the one-time trapeze artist from the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, who became my platoon sergeant, had survived alone and with only a cut lip and a lingering deafness, the explosion from a mortar shell that literally vaporized the 2 other occupants of his foxhole. Both the farmer and the acrobat had been in the Pacific for nearly 3 years, not once given stateside rest. They were wasting away from homesickness, and though their tough outward show of stoicism moved me, the despairing fear in the dark wells of their eyes was a giveaway and inextinguishable. Neither of them believed they had the faintest hope of living through the invasion of the mainland of Japan, but, however uncommonly suffocating the fear felt by the old campaigners, it was an agony to which very few were really immune. All of us felt it. Herman Melville wrote, "All wars are boyish." I love that phrase. All wars are boyish and are fought by boys. I cannot say from this distance in time what is more firmly lodged in my memory, the desperate fatalism and sadness that pervaded beneath our nervous bravado the days and nights of us young boys, or the joy we felt when we heard of the bomb of Hiroshima and of the thrilling turnaround of our destinies. It was a war we all believed in, and I'd wanted to test my manhood. Part of me mourned that I never got near the combat zone. But Hiroshima removed from my shoulders an almost tactile burden of insecurity and dread. Later, I often used the word ecstasy to describe my reaction. I used it again only a few years ago in, of all places, Tokyo, where a TV interviewer asked me to express my views about Hiroshima and related matters. My friend Kurt Vonnegut was with me at that time, and he remembers with horror and fright the fact that I told the interviewer in certain terms that I thought the bomb was a good thing. Afterwards, I had the feeling I'd misspoken badly. But later at a party, a Japanese man of my vintage approached me. It turned out he spoke extremely good fluent English, told me that he had studied, amazing combination, at the University of California at Berkeley, both Western philosophy and electronics, and was in charge of a large unit of Mitsubishi. Anyway, he approached me, murmuring a little surreptitiously that he'd seen me on television and wanted to tell me something he'd never told anyone before, including his wife. He said he'd also been a young infantry officer, the leader of a heavy mortar unit training in Kyushu to repel our invasion. When the word came of the bomb and the end of the war, we might have blown each other up, he added, and when I asked him how he'd taken the news, he gave one of those polite Japanese smiles and said, "I felt ecstasy, like you did." And this brings me to an issue which has incited more controversy than perhaps any other in the writing of the history of World War II, and that is the justification itself for dropping the atomic bomb. As I've pointed out already, I belong to that small body of veterans who were headed for the invasion. We're getting smaller as a group each year through obvious reasons of attrition, and many of us remain extremely sensitive to the moral implications of the bomb. We were never a large group in terms of the general population. There were originally probably 250,000 of us, Marines, Army, and Navy, and Coast Guard, and probably considerably less than 100,000 are left in the United States, which is not much in a nation of 250 million. Despite what I've said about the lifelong gratitude most of us felt for the bomb and its makers, there are a few of us, I suspect, who wouldn't be troubled if it were ever shown conclusively that Hiroshima and Nagasaki could have been avoided. Even the most callous ex-serviceman might be shaken by proof that his own salvation was bought by the needless sacrifice of 200,000 innocent human beings. Therefore, there were more than a few of us who were disturbed by the revisionist view espoused by numerous historians on the 50th anniversary of the bomb 2 years ago, who took the occasion of the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution to make what was tantamount to a dreadful accusation, namely that President Truman behaved in an irresponsible, even criminal fashion in ordering the bomb dropped, when he must have been aware that the weapon was really not necessary for ending the war. The Enola Gay, of course, was the B-29 aircraft that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. The Enola Gay exhibit, and some of you probably followed this in the news, became the focal point of the controversy. And this dispute became nasty when such groups as the American Legion and the Air Force Association protested the underlying assumptions of the display. They claimed that it was anti-American, that it muddied the patriotic waters with ambiguities and bothersome questions about the bomb's ultimate worth, as if its use were not absolutely just. Quite simply, the critics of the exhibit wanted a celebration. The Smithsonian backed down, and the exhibit became a tame and harmless sideshow. This was unfortunate, since the original text, which I read in detail, reveals that the questions raised were legitimate. It's still worth pondering, as the Dutch-born historian Ian Buruma, who is possibly the best critic I've ever read of the whole issue of the bomb and its meaning. He wrote, whether the bomb was an act of racism, this was important to ponder. Also, whether the bombs were dropped to warn the Soviet Union and keep them from invading Japan, whether Truman should have paid more attention to Japanese peace initiatives, and whether there were better ways than nuclear bombing of ending the war swiftly. These, according to Beruma, I totally agree, were worth being examined at the Smithsonian exhibit. But of course, the exhibit was shut down, and the organizers, one of them had to resign under a dark cloud. But perhaps most importantly, the Smithsonian's capitulation to the American Legion, and this is the most important thing, sent the wrong message to the Japanese, who have been scandalously negligent in facing up to the enormities of their own past. If the Americans can continue to insist on their own righteousness, the Japanese are now able to say, why can't we do the same? And I will return to this Japanese historical amnesia in a moment. One doesn't wish to regard these revisionist historians with impatience or contempt. They are by and large serious and dedicated scholars who have invested much intellectual capital in presenting their theses. One of the best known of the historians, Gar Alperovitz, has written hundreds of pages in many books attempting to prove that Truman dropped the bomb to show our supremacy to the Soviet Union. Other critics, notably the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, are convinced that the Japanese would have surrendered anyway, and that therefore Truman, knowing of this, must have possessed the capacity for irrational behavior bordering on madness. In other words, Truman's decision was an act of megalomania. One of the revisionist scholars, Philip Nobile, went so far as to canvass various writers, like myself, especially writers who were veterans of World War II, asking if they would sign a petition to President Clinton, the purpose of which would be that he apologized to the Japanese people. Needless to say, I declined. But in a book he edited called Judgment at the Smithsonian, to which I contributed my dissent, he made clear that his own anti-bomb, anti-Truman viewpoint was based largely, like many others, on moral outrage, an outrage which in turn derived from some religious wellspring. In his case, Nobile is an active Catholic layman and often uses words like atonement, repentance, and original sin. As if all of this were not enough, an ABC television news special led by Peter Jennings, who is a Canadian, was unequivocally slanted against the bomb and Harry Truman. Of course, it's entirely understandable that a phenomenon as unique and as monstrous as the atomic bomb and the indescribable suffering it caused should arouse such soul-searching. And it's doubtless healthy, too. The use of any weapon so terrible and the political power that puts that use into play needs vigilant scrutiny, not merely now, but for generations. Therefore, revisionism, puzzling and exasperating as it often has been, is a welcome activity, especially in an America too often blind to its own global propensity for force majeure. One must honor doubts, whether their roots are psychological, political, or religious. Never let it be forgotten that even as I speak, there are innumerable atomic weapons stashed away all over the world, and that the end of the Cold War did not relieve us from the necessity of constantly pondering their existence. Yet as I reflect on that event of 1945, I can't help being convinced that Truman had no alternative to his decision and that his choice was the right one, even though its absolute rightness can never really be proved. Its rightness can never be proved, among other factors, at least to universal satisfaction, because so much of the decision was bound up in the understandably bellicose psychology of that time. Might not Truman have behaved differently if he, like most of his fellow Americans, especially young Marines such as Lieutenant William Styron, were not consumed with a need for retaliation and with a savage rage against the enemy that 3.5 years of brutal fighting had engendered? It's easy, from the comfortable perspective of hindsight, for a psychiatrist like Robert J. Lifton, who through no fault of his own did not serve in the war, to confuse such rage with megalomania and to regard the decision to use the bomb as a form of madness. Perhaps only those who literally and truly remember Pearl Harbor can comprehend the national fury. Yet it's hard to see how even a Harry Truman, totally dispassionate and unaffected by rage, could have acted in any other way. And this opinion derives from two hard facts embedded in the conduct of the war itself. First, it must be remembered that by the time the first atomic weapon was dropped in August 1945, the mainland of Japan had been subjected to the most ruthless destruction visited upon a nation in the history of warfare. On a single night in March, over 100,000 civilians died when General LeMay's B-29s firebombed Tokyo. The bombs had produced an incendiary storm, destroying helpless hordes in heat so violent that those who had sought shelter in underground tunnels suffered an actual liquefaction. They were not lucky enough to be swiftly incinerated, but they were broiled alive, while people who had tried to find safety in the river shallows were burnt to cinders. I still have a letter from a Marine friend of mine who was on the island of Saipan when those B-29s took off from across the channel on Tinian, a few miles away, and he watched them in their flight toward Tokyo in the night. And he wrote, "Why I was unable to feel repelled or to be touched by a tremor of pity, I could not say. Even as I gazed up through the twilight at the howling monsters speeding northward to drop their cargoes on numberless cowering Yokohama mamas and toothless, slant-eyed old farts in baggy drawers and schoolgirls and roly-poly wee baby sands, my Presbyterian conscience bade me to weep, but I was dry-eyed, which is what war does to you," he concluded. "It fucks up your heart." What my friend was witnessing happened to be a routine example of strategy that began in the 1930s with the Japanese bombing of civilians in China, resumed in the Nazi destruction of Guernica in Spain, with the firebombing by the Luftwaffe of London and Coventry and Manchester and other urban centers in Britain. And let us not minimize the primitive moral appeal of the question, then, who started this after all? Our own evil was bound to follow. The British and Americans' senseless air attack on Dresden, in which multitudes were cremated, was a horrible amplification of this barbaric custom. Now, there is no moral justification for the destruction of civilians under any circumstance, but it has to be understood that by August, Harry Truman and his advisors saw the dropping of the atomic device as a logical extension of strategic bombing. As the late McGeorge Bundy wrote, By the summer of 1945, both military and political leaders came to think of urban destruction not as wicked, not even as a necessary evil, but as a result with its own military value, unquote. One need not justify the morality of his decision to understand that Truman regarded the atom bomb as just another, only more effective, weapon in the arsenal of total destruction. In their different ways, Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill would have all approved. And it should be mentioned here, parenthetically, that very recent evidence all points to the incontrovertible fact that had the atomic bomb been developed in time, it would have been used on the Germans. In fact, it was developed to be used on the Germans, which removes a small element of our racial animus against the Japanese. But ultimately, the rightfulness of Truman's judgment rests on one crucial question, and that is whether or not the Japanese were ready to surrender. If, as virtually all the revisionists seem to assume, the enemy was prepared to accept Allied peace terms, then indeed the dropping of the bomb was not only unnecessary, but morally indefensible. But there's no indication that the Japanese were going to throw in the towel. And this is a matter that the critics refuse to confront, either pussyfooting around such a critical issue or pretending that surrender was imminent while offering no evidence to support the fact. Ian Baruma has written, "Close examination of what went on in Tokyo shows that the Japanese were not on the verge of capitulation before the destruction of Hiroshima. So long as there was no unanimity in the war cabinet and the emperor remained silent, the war would go on." On a purely military level, too, all the indications were that Japanese were prepared to fight to the last man and indeed the last woman and child. Proclamations had gone out to this effect, and if this were not enough, there were the recent examples of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the ferocious resistance of the enemy provided a foretaste of the butchery awaiting both sides when the Americans embarked on their invasion of the mainland. Suppose it has been asked that Harry Truman, for whatever reason behind his caution, had not dropped the bomb. And suppose then that Americans and Japanese had engaged in the predicted battle, a savage struggle which, following the pattern of the bloody stalemate on Okinawa, would have taken months and consumed tens of thousands of mostly young lives. Suppose after the inevitable American victory it had been revealed that the President of the United States had possessed all along a weapon that most likely would have ended the war, but had not used it. What would countless bereaved parents have thought about that? What would have been the reaction in America and throughout the world? The question gives rise to such an awesome moment of hushed speculation that one must necessarily end the matter by affirming the truth that for Truman, there was no other choice. A journalist friend of mine who lives in Honolulu has several times interviewed Japanese tourists who visit the memorial site at Pearl Harbor. Japanese tourists are, to say the least, numerous in Hawaii. Japan Airlines flies an incredible 72 flights a day from Tokyo, and my friend has buttonholed quite a few of them. Some of the visitors are fairly sophisticated about modern history, but most are not. The great majority tell my journalist friend that America started the war and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was in retaliation for our aggression. This is an example of the historical amnesia afflicting the Japanese people I mentioned earlier. Except among a relatively small group of the intelligentsia, it is a national article of faith that the devastation and death wrought by the atomic bomb was an evil phenomenon, the result of American inhumanity, with no causation rooted in the Japanese militarism of the 1920s and 30s. History books at the elementary and high school level avoid mention of the rape of Nanking or the barbaric plunder in Manchuria. I alluded earlier to the Japanese oppression of prisoners. Nowhere in the history books that young people have access to in Japan is there reference to the enslavement during World War II of hundreds of thousands of Koreans, many of them women forced to serve in Japanese army brothels. The atrocities committed by imperial troops during the course of the war, from Bataan to the Philippines to the farthest reaches of Southeast Asia, exist in a vacuum, unrecorded. A recent work, published only a year or so ago, by an Australian-born scholar, Gavin Dawes, called The Prisoners of the Japanese, has meticulously documented the depredations of the Japanese army in Indonesia and Malaysia. He employs new and original research, and he's interviewed dozens of Australian, Dutch, British, American, and Asian survivors, and he provides a panorama of butchery and torture far scarier than could have been previously imagined. It shows a deliberate, carefully executed program of slave labor designed to work captives until they died of starvation and exhaustion. It was a technique of total domination, every bit as ruthless as that of the Nazis at Auschwitz, and might have been considered genocidal, except for the fact that it was even worse. It was pan-racial, condemning everyone to death without ethnic partiality. The Japanese people today, of course, refuse themselves access to such knowledge, preferring the cultural comfort of timeless victimhood. Having said this about post-war Japan, I want to stress an obvious truth. No nation is without shame or the stain of past dishonor. To the great credit of the Germans, the horrors of Nazi despotism have been anatomized and dissected until scarcely a personality or event of that era remains unexamined. And it's been especially emphasized recently by the interest focused by the Germans on the book by a young American scholar, Daniel Goldhagen, which reveals much, much more about the common Germans' complicity in the Nazi tyranny than anyone ever imagined before. We Americans have pored over the disgraceful episodes of our past with nearly morbid zeal. Slavery, the decimation of our Native Americans, our unconscionable racism in modern times, and the nightmare of Vietnam. All of these have received our impassioned, sometimes even masochistic scrutiny. But the Japanese have averted their eyes from history, and in doing so have jeopardized their future and perhaps our future too, because people who have no lessons to learn from their past are bound to be extremely dangerous. I want to close with a few final reflections on racism and on Auschwitz. When in the mid-1970s I decided to write about another racism, the Nazi racism of total domination, I realized that in dealing with the German mind of that period, I had to confront certain exquisite paradoxes. Anglo-Saxons, for example, however bitterly abhorred, did not belong among the despised Untermenschen, and in the war, especially in the military, were granted a certain provisional respect. A loony relativism at the heart of Hitler's racial policy is demonstrated by the treatment of various prisoners of war. The captured British and American soldiers and airmen, while hardly coddled, were usually confined in a prison where conditions were basically civilized, and in fact so comparatively congenial that the farcical image conveyed in Hogan's Heroes is not too far off the mark. The statistical difference between the treatment by the Japanese of their prisoners and that of the Germans there's a yawning a chasm between the numbers. The Japanese simply exterminated their prisoners. Whatever else their failings, the Germans did not embark on the same process of almost ethnic extermination. It was a reputed Nordic identification that prevented all but a small percentage of Allied prisoners from dying. Contrasting this is the appalling saga of the Soviet prisoners of war, who were, after the Jews, the numerically largest group of victims and whose partial annihilation, over 3 million, or nearly 60% of all Soviet POWs, is commentary enough on the Nazis' view of the humanity of the Russians and other Slavs. And this brings me to Auschwitz. I was always struck by the fact that the first executed victims of Auschwitz were not Jews, but 600 Soviet prisoners of war. Although the Holocaust was uniquely Jewish, its uniqueness becomes more striking when we can see that it was also, in a way, ecumenical, but in ways that can only emphasize the peculiar nature of Jewish suffering. I have been criticized in some quarters for de-Judaizing and universalizing the Holocaust by creating, in Sophie's Choice, a heroine who was a Gentile victim of Auschwitz. But this was not my intention. It was rather to show the malign effect of anti-Semitism and its relentless power of such breadth, at least in the Nazis' hand, as to be capable of destroying people beyond the focus of its immediate oppression. At Auschwitz, as in the Inferno, Jews occupied the center of hell, but the surrounding concentric rings embraced a multitude of other victims. It would be wrong for them to be forgotten. For years, all of them were largely forgotten, beyond the borders of Jewish remembrance. It wasn't until the late 1970s that the word Holocaust, and this is an amazing fact to me, fully entered the language. Before then, the horror of the camps had a less discernible shape. And finally, as for that other monolith of dread, Hiroshima, it might be said that the sacrifice of its victims represented an object lesson and perhaps a warning, preventing the future use of the weapon that achieved such destruction. If so, the many deaths and the suffering, the same that assured my probable survival and that of my Tokyo comrade of arms, along with legions of others, may be justified if we who have lived so long afterward are fit to justify such a fathomless event. Certainly the bomb did nothing to eliminate war and aggression, and I'm still amazed at the memory of myself, a boy optimist returned home after Hiroshima, firmly convinced for one brief and intoxicating moment that the future held out the hope of illimitable peace. Over 50 years after that moment, the fratricidal horrors and ethnic atrocities that the world has endured and still endures remain at the edge of tolerance and are past comprehension. Yet we go on, the earth turns. If you do what I do, and my brethren here on the stage do, you write. And as the canny Isaac Dinesen said, you must do, you write without hope and without despair. Thank you.